This summer, we're looking at the book of Mark, and it's the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel are the first 4 books of the New Testament. And Mark, the author of this Gospel, was a young man who was mentored by one of Jesus' best friends, a guy named Peter. And many of his accounts, many of the stories that Mark writes, are likely stories he heard directly from Peter. It's the shortest and the most action-packed gospel account. Mark provides very little editorial content. He mostly allows the stories to kind of speak for themselves. And in Mark, we find this guy, Jesus, who is going to be the most unusual leader that our world has ever known. So we're in chapter 2. We're going to be starting in verse 13. It says this, "Then Jesus went out to the lakeshore again and taught the crowds that were coming to him." Like I said, Jesus went out. He went to the crowds. He kind of did this outdoor teaching thing. He was along a lake. And he spent a ton of time in small towns and villages in the countryside. It's not the most normal place to start a global movement, but that's where Jesus went. Verse 14, "As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at his tax collector's booth. 'Follow me and be my disciple,' Jesus said to him. So Levi got up and followed him." Now, from a first glance at this passage, it would just seem to be a chance encounter, an impulsive invitation. But you must understand, Jesus never did anything by accident. He planned out every step that he was going to take. And he knew before Mark was even born that he would one day write about this. He decided thousands of years ago, thousands of years before this day, to walk along that lake and to run into Levi, a guy also known as Matthew. And he decided that when he saw him, he was going to invite him to become his student and his friend. But you have to understand, in the culture where Jesus was, this was not a small thing. Tax collectors were not respected people. Tax collectors like Levi had sold out their countrymen. You see, at the time, the nation of Israel was occupied by an imperial power known as Rome. And what the Romans did is they had their own countrymen, the people of the country they occupied, they had their own countrymen become their tax collectors. And taxation was a big way that the empire of Rome kept the people in subjugation. It's how they kept them down, by levying huge taxes. And tax collectors would skim off the top. They would charge more for people's taxes than they had to in order to fund an expensive lifestyle, a rich person's lifestyle. They would take from the working people and they would take more money than they had to. And that was how they funded their own lives. And in fact, I was just talking with Pastor Justin this morning before I preached, and he was sharing with me that he read that it was actually that tax collectors of the sort that Levi would have to bid on contracts for tax collecting. And so oftentimes the people who were in the position were the people who would take the most amount of money over the top, not people who were willing to give away less. The Romans self-selected for countrymen who were willing, who were greedy, who wanted to live those lifestyles. And tax collectors like Levi, they would be in a booth and you would see this guy all the time. Oftentimes you would see him when you were going out to go fishing, and he might charge you to go out to go fishing. And tax collectors were considered traitors to their people. And they let their own people live in poverty, but they got wealthy. And so they were outcast by the rest of their people. They were denied the opportunity to enter the temple to worship God. Their family, their friends, and their community had rejected them because of what they did. And so this was a trade that people like Levi made. They traded the love of their friends, their family, and their country for money. And every time you went to pay Levi your taxes, you would probably look at him with a little bit of disgust if you lived in his community. because that was the way they were treated. That was how they were viewed. But then one day, this guy comes along the lakeside, and Levi's going to meet him, and he's going to be unlike anyone else Levi has ever met. And when he looks at Levi, he's not going to look with the eyes of disgust. He's not going to look at him as a traitor. He's inviting him to become his student and his friend. And Jesus' invitation draws him in, unlike anything he's ever experienced. And so Levi's going to leave everything and follow Jesus. And you can tell the immense gratitude he must have felt by what he does next. Look at verse 15. Later, Levi invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. There were many people of this kind among Jesus' followers. So here's Levi's response to Jesus. He immediately responds to his call. He says, I'm going to follow Jesus. And then what he does is he takes this respected rabbi, this teacher, to his home. And he invites more of his traitor, sinner, disreputable friends to come and eat with them. I can't help but wonder what was going through Levi's mind as he's introducing his friends to Jesus. Because like him, most of them probably were looked at by the people around them like they were something broken, like they were something dirty, like they didn't want to associate with them. They were described as unclean people by the religious and moral people. But when Jesus looked at Levi, he knew this guy was different. And so he immediately invited his other outcast friends to come and see this guy who's going to treat them differently than anyone else. Levi makes a big dinner, and he invites Jesus and his friends. He invites some of his other students. But it's not just Levi and his friends who know that this happens. Look at verse 16. When the teachers of the religious law, who were the Pharisees, saw him eating with tax collectors and other sinners, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with such scum?" Can you imagine being described that way? But at the same time knowing that sitting across the table from you is this guy who doesn't treat you that way. Jesus wasn't looking for the cream of the crop according to his culture's view. He wasn't looking for the well-educated, the well-off, the influencers of his culture. He wasn't looking for people who looked right, for people who could check off their attendance sheet. He was looking for people who, when they met him, immediately responded and followed him. You see, Jesus saw past the outer layer into what was inside people's hearts. For Samuel tells us that the Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Who is this to us in our world today? Who are the people that we think of as scum? Maybe who are the outcasts, the rejected, the lonely? Well, the answer may be as unpopular in churches today as it was in Jesus' time to those religious people. It might be the people, the very people that religious people, that moral people don't associate with. It might be the young man who's in jail for drugs and theft. It might be the young woman who's selling herself on a street corner. It might be the person who's living in a gay or homosexual lifestyle. These are the people that I think if Jesus were here today, he'd be reaching out to first. He'd be coming to the sinners of our culture, and the people that moral and religious people often reject, and he'd be inviting them to follow him. You see, he didn't invite Levi to sit in his booth and be a tax collector. He invited him to leave that behind and follow after him, because he could see past the outer layer, past what Levi looked like, and he saw that in his heart, Levi had the capacity, the ability to follow Jesus. Recently, on the 4th of July, I got the opportunity to see a movie. I would highly recommend, if you get a chance, to see this movie. It's called The Sound of Hope, and it's the story of a town in Texas, Possum Trot, and a small little church in Possum Trot, Texas. In this town, there were 22 families who went to this church who were burdened to rescue kids who had been rejected and caught up in the social work system. And these families from this small rural town, they adopted together a grand total of 77 kids, providing loving homes for kids who needed one. In fact, my favorite scene from this movie is near the end. The pastor from this church calls the lady who they've been working with from social services to place these kids in these homes. And the lady, he says, "Hey, I just talked to another couple, and we've got another couple who's ready to take some kids. Who do you have for us?" And the lady is able to tell him, "There's no one within 100 miles of your town that needs to be placed." This is a true story of what one small group of followers of Jesus did when they looked out and they saw the rejects of their culture and said, "You know what? Jesus would go to them. Jesus would be there for them. He would show up. He'd have dinner with them." And it's something that is not easy to do, but it's something that's so, so important. Jesus heard what the religious leaders said. He knew how they viewed Levi and his friends. And Jesus had some words for them. Look at verse 17. When Jesus heard this, when he heard them say, "Why does he eat with such scum?" he told them, "Healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. I have come not to call those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners." I have not come to call those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners. We have the opportunity to be the hands and feet of Jesus. We have the opportunity to reach out to people who desperately need him, because the church was not meant to be a country club for the comfortable. We're not meant to just attend like we would a club. No, the church is supposed to be a hospital for the hurting. As followers of Jesus, we are supposed to be reaching out to people like Levi the tax collector. We're supposed to be reaching out to people that other people who call themselves religious would say, "I don't want anything to do with those people." Because it is not about reaching people who think they're righteous.